Judge Elizabeth Carter sat behind the grand oak bench in courtroom 5, her posture impeccable, a symbol of her reputation for fairness and precision. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall, narrow windows, casting long shadows across the room, adding a somber tone to what seemed, at first glance, like just another ordinary trial. But today, something was different. Elizabeth could feel it in her bones, an uneasy tension that crawled beneath her skin, making her hands colder than usual. The defendant, John Mitchell, sat across from her, shackled by both his wrists and ankles. His demeanor was calm, unnervingly so, as though the accusations against him were trivial. He wore the standard orange jumpsuit of the district jail, his unshaven face hinting at weeks without proper care. Yet, despite his unkempt appearance, there was an undeniable air of mystery about him, something that Elizabeth couldn't quite place. As the prosecutor, District Attorney Matthew Harris, began his opening statement, Elizabeth's attention was diverted, not to the facts of the case, but to a small detail that had tugged at her mind since the moment John had been escorted into the courtroom. Around his neck, barely visible beneath the collar of his jumpsuit, was a necklace, a silver necklace. Her heart skipped a beat. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Her vision blurred for a second, and she blinked rapidly, trying to refocus. There it was again, gleaming faintly as the light from the windows reflected off it. It was the same necklace she had given her daughter Emma almost 10 years ago. The same necklace Emma had been wearing the day she disappeared. Elizabeth clenched her gavel tightly, fighting to keep her composure. Her mind raced, memories flashing before her eyes. Emma, with her bright smile and sparkling eyes, wearing that necklace on her 17th birthday, the delicate silver chain, the unique, intricate design, there was no mistaking it. It was one of a kind. She had commissioned it herself, a custom piece from a jeweler who had retired years ago. How could this man, this stranger, be wearing it? The defendant is accused of multiple counts of conspiracy and the illegal distribution of classified government data, Harris continued, his voice steady and unwavering. The evidence against him is overwhelming. We have documents, digital records, and testimony from key witnesses who... But Elizabeth wasn't listening anymore. The words flowed over her like a distant hum. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the necklace. Her chest tightened, and she struggled to breathe. A million questions bombarded her mind. Was this just a coincidence? Was it possible that John Mitchell had somehow acquired the necklace through an innocent means? Or was this connected to Emma? Was she still alive? No. She had to focus. She was a judge, after all. Her duty was to the law, to justice, not to her personal grief. She couldn't allow her emotions to cloud her judgment. But how could she ignore what was right in front of her? The very symbol of her daughter's disappearance was hanging around the neck of a man accused of high-level crimes against the government. Elizabeth's mind swirled with confusion as the courtroom's procedural hum continued around her. The defense attorney, David O'Connor, was speaking now, but his voice seemed miles away. She caught fragments of sentences, circumstantial evidence, lack of direct proof, unjust accusations, but none of it mattered to her anymore. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the air becoming heavier, thicker. She had to know. She had to find out how John Mitchell had come into possession of that necklace. The thought consumed her, overriding any professional detachment she had once prided herself on. But what could she do? She couldn't just stop the trial and demand answers for something that, on the surface, had nothing to do with the case at hand. Your Honor, Harris said, snapping her back to reality, if it pleases the court, we'd like to proceed with the first witness. Elizabeth swallowed hard, her throat dry. She nodded, her voice caught in her chest, unable to form the words. She quickly banged the gavel in approval, her hand trembling slightly as it hit the bench. The sound echoed through the room, a hollow reminder of her responsibilities. The first witness, a government agent by the name of Agent Claire Davidson, took the stand. She was young, sharp, with a no-nonsense attitude that made it clear she was here to get the job done. Her testimony began as expected, laying out the case against John Mitchell in precise, clear terms. According to Davidson, Mitchell had been involved in a classified government project known as Operation Nightfall, a program so secret that even most high-ranking officials had no knowledge of its existence. Mitchell, it was alleged, had stolen critical information about Nightfall and was preparing to sell it to foreign entities. The consequences of such a leak, Davidson explained, would have been catastrophic, potentially compromising national security and putting thousands of lives at risk. Elizabeth tried to focus on the testimony, but her gaze kept drifting back to the necklace. The more she stared at it, the more her heart raced. She felt the room spin slightly, the walls blurring around her. She pressed her palm to her chest, trying to calm the rapid thudding of her heart. She couldn't breathe. Panic began to creep into her thoughts. "Your Honor, are you all right?" O'Connor's voice broke through the fog in her mind, laced with concern. Elizabeth opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Her vision dimmed. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the gleam of the silver necklace around John Mitchell's neck. When Elizabeth regained consciousness, she was lying on a bench in her chambers, a glass of water on the small table next to her. The room was dimly lit, the noise of the courtroom now a distant memory. Claire, her clerk, was sitting nearby, her brow furrowed with worry. "You fainted," Claire said softly, handing her the glass. "Do you need to go home?" Elizabeth sat up slowly, the memory of what had happened rushing back to her. The trial, the necklace, John Mitchell. She shook her head firmly, setting the glass aside. "No," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "I'm fine. We need to continue." "Judge Carter," Claire began, hesitating. "Are you sure you're okay? You've been under a lot of stress recently, and—" "I'm fine," Elizabeth snapped more sharply than she intended. She took a deep breath, softening her tone. "I'm sorry, Claire. It's just, I need to finish this trial. There's something I need to know." Claire didn't push further, sensing the gravity in Elizabeth's voice. She nodded quietly and stood to leave, but before exiting the room, she glanced back at her boss. "There's something else, Judge," Claire added. "That man, John Mitchell. He has to speak with you. Alone." Elizabeth froze. Her mind raced. Why would John Mitchell, a man she had no personal connection to, want to speak to her directly? Did he know about Emma? Did he know what the necklace meant to her? Or was this all part of some twisted game? "Bring him to me," Elizabeth said, her voice steady now, the judge and her taking control once more. As Claire left the room, Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap, but her resolve was firm. She would get answers. She had to, because if this man knew something about Emma, if he knew where her daughter was, she would stop at nothing to find the truth. Judge Elizabeth Carter sat in her chambers, the echo of John Mitchell's request still ringing in her ears. Why did he want to speak with her alone? What could he possibly have to say? Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, all spiraling around the silver necklace that had sent her spiraling just hours ago. The very same necklace that once belonged to her daughter Emma. Emma had disappeared nearly a decade ago, leaving behind nothing but a trail of unanswered questions. It had been one of the darkest times in Elizabeth's life, dark enough that she had almost given up her career, her passion for justice, to search endlessly for her daughter. And now, all these years later, that necklace had reappeared, hanging around the neck of a man accused of some of the most serious crimes against the government. Elizabeth ran a hand through her hair, trying to steady her thoughts. She had to be calm. She had to keep her emotions in check, no matter how impossible that seemed right now. She was a judge, a figure of authority and control. But inside, she was unraveling. The door creaked open and Claire, her loyal clerk, stepped inside. "He's here," Claire said quietly, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you sure you want to do this, Judge Carter? You've had a rough day." Elizabeth nodded firmly. "I'm sure." Claire stepped aside, and John Mitchell entered the room, escorted by 2 guards. His hands were shackled in front of him, and his ankles were bound with chains. Yet despite his restraints, there was something unnerving about the calm, almost serene expression he wore. His blue eyes were sharp, observing every inch of the room as if it held secrets he already knew. The guards left, and the door closed behind them, leaving Elizabeth alone with Mitchell. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken tension. Elizabeth remained seated behind her desk, unwilling to give Mitchell the satisfaction of standing to face him. Mitchell, for his part, didn't seem fazed by the silence. In fact, he appeared comfortable in it, like a man who had learned to master the art of waiting. Finally, Elizabeth spoke, her voice cold and sharp. "What is it you want to say to me, Mr. Mitchell? Why did you request this meeting?" John Mitchell tilted his head slightly, as if considering her question. He reached up with his cupped hands and tugged gently at the chain around his neck, pulling the silver necklace into view. The small pendant glinted in the dim light of her office. "I believe this belongs to you," he said quietly, his voice calm but laced with something darker. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest, her eyes fixed on the necklace. It was identical in every way to the one she had given Emma. Every swirl, every intricate detail of the design was etched into her memory. It wasn't just similar, it was the same necklace. "How did you get that?" she demanded, her voice cracking despite her effort to remain composed. Mitchell's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "That's the question, isn't it?" Elizabeth's hands clenched into fists on the desk in front of her. She wasn't in the mood for games. "I'm not interested in riddles, Mitchell. How did you come into possession of that necklace?" Mitchell stared at her for a long moment before speaking. "It was given to me, Judge Carter, by someone who knew it would bring me to you." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. Someone gave it to him, but who? The possibilities raced through her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Could it be someone connected to Emma? Was her daughter still alive? Did she send the necklace herself? "Who gave it to you?" Elizabeth asked, her voice softer now, almost pleading. Mitchell's smile faded. "I think you already know the answer to that." Elizabeth froze, her mind racing. What did he mean? How could she possibly know? Her thoughts went back to the days following Emma's disappearance. There had been no leads, no suspects, nothing but a hollow emptiness where her daughter once was. The police had concluded that Emma had likely been abducted, but they had no evidence to support that theory. The case went cold, and eventually, so did Elizabeth's hope. But now, here was this man sitting in front of her, suggesting that there was something more, something she had missed all those years ago. Mitchell shifted in his seat, the chains rattling softly. "You've been looking in the wrong places, Judge Carter. The answers you seek aren't in the past, they're in the present, and they involve people far more powerful than you realize." Elizabeth narrowed her eyes. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about your government," Mitchell said, his voice steady. "I'm talking about the secrets they keep, the things they're willing to do to protect those secrets. And I'm talking about your daughter." Elizabeth felt her stomach drop. "What do you know about Emma?" she demanded, her voice rising with desperation. Mitchell leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto hers. She was part of something bigger than you can imagine, something that got her noticed by the wrong people. She knew too much, and they made sure she disappeared. Elizabeth felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. What Mitchell was saying didn't make sense. Emma had been a college student, just starting her life. She had no connection to the government, no reason to be involved in anything that would make her a target. "You're lying," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Emma was just a kid. She had nothing to do with any of this." Mitchell's expression softened, as if he pitied her. "I wish that were true," he said quietly. "But the fact is, your daughter was involved in something far beyond her control. And the people who took her, they're still watching. They're still pulling the strings." Elizabeth stared at him, her mind reeling. Could it be true? Could Emma have stumbled into something dangerous? Something that had led to her disappearance? And if so, how was John Mitchell connected to it? Mitchell sat back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. "The necklace," he said, nodding toward the pendant around his neck. "It's a symbol, a marker. It means that those who wear it are part of a select group. People who have seen things, people who know things. Your daughter was one of them." Elizabeth shook her head, refusing to believe it. "That's impossible. Emma had no connection to any of this." Mitchell's eyes darkened. "You don't know your daughter as well as you think you do, Judge Carter. She was involved in something bigger than both of us. And now, because of that, you're involved too." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mitchell smiled again, but this time it was cold, devoid of warmth. "I don't want anything from you, Judge, but there are others who will, and they won't stop until they get it." Elizabeth stared at him, her mind racing. She didn't know what to believe anymore. Could it be true? Could Emma have been caught up in something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined? And if so, what was her role in all of this now? Mitchell stood as the guards re-entered the room, ready to escort him back to his cell. He paused at the door, turning to face her one last time. "Remember, Judge," he said softly, "nothing is as it seems, and the people you trust the most might be the ones hiding the biggest secrets." And with that, he was gone, leaving Elizabeth alone in her chambers, her thoughts swirling like a storm. Elizabeth Carter sat in her car outside her suburban home, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her knuckles were white, her jaw clenched as the words John Mitchell had spoken to her hours earlier replayed endlessly in her mind. "Your daughter was one of them." The phrase echoed like a haunting melody, stirring up a torrent of emotions she had long tried to bury. Could it be true? Could Emma, her sweet, vibrant Emma, have been involved in something dangerous, something that led to her disappearance? She stared out the windshield, her vision unfocused, as memories of her daughter filled her mind. Emma had been 17 when she vanished, on the cusp of adulthood, full of life and ambition. She had always been a bright student, excelling in her studies and eager to explore the world beyond the sheltered bubble of suburban life. Elizabeth had watched her daughter grow with pride, believing that Emma was destined for greatness. But there had been things Elizabeth hadn't known, parts of Emma's life that had remained hidden, secrets that now seemed to hold the key to her disappearance. The necklace, that damn necklace. How could it have ended up with John Mitchell? And what did he mean when he said it was a marker? Elizabeth's thoughts spun in circles as she tried to piece together the fragments of information Mitchell had given her. The more she thought about it, the more her stomach churned with a nauseating combination of fear and uncertainty. Finally, with a deep breath, Elizabeth unclenched her fingers from the steering wheel and stepped out of the car. The cool evening air hit her face, bringing a brief sense of clarity. She needed answers. She couldn't sit back and let this torment her any longer. It was time to confront the past she had tried so hard to forget, the past that now seemed to be clawing its way back into her life. Inside the house, Elizabeth made her way to the small study she rarely used anymore. The room had once been a refuge, a place where she could escape the pressures of work and family. But after Emma's disappearance, it had become a tomb of memories she couldn't bear to revisit. The walls were lined with bookshelves, each shelf packed with volumes that had gathered dust over the years. In the corner, an old wooden desk sat untouched, a layer of dust covering its surface. Elizabeth opened the top drawer of the desk, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out a small, weathered box. It was the only thing she had left of Emma, a collection of personal items that the police had returned to her after the investigation into her disappearance had gone cold. She hadn't opened the box in years, unable to face the pain it held. But now, she needed to. She needed to know if there was something, anything, inside that could help her understand what had happened to her daughter. With a deep breath, Elizabeth lifted the lid of the box. Inside were a few photographs, a journal, and a handful of trinkets that Emma had collected over the years. Elizabeth's fingers traced the edges of a picture frame, her heart aching as she looked at the photo of her and Emma on her daughter's 16th birthday. They were both smiling, their arms wrapped around each other in a warm embrace. Emma's eyes sparkled with joy, her smile wide and full of life. How had everything gone so wrong? Elizabeth set the photograph aside and reached for the journal. It was a simple, leather-bound notebook, the pages worn from use. She flipped it open, scanning the familiar handwriting that belonged to her daughter. The entries were filled with the typical musings of a teenager, thoughts about school, friends, and dreams for the future. But as Elizabeth flipped through the pages, something caught her eye. There, tucked between two entries about college applications and a weekend trip with friends, was a short, cryptic note that sent a chill down her spine. They told me to keep quiet, but I can't. I have to know the truth. What they're doing, it's not right. I think I'm in over my head, but I can't back out now. Not after what I've seen. Elizabeth's heart raced as she read the words over and over again. What was Emma talking about? Who were they? And what had Emma seen that had made her feel so scared, so trapped? The note was dated just a week before Emma had disappeared. Elizabeth's hands shook as she closed the journal, her mind spinning with questions. What had her daughter gotten herself involved in? And why hadn't she noticed that something was wrong? The guilt gnawed at her, a familiar feeling that she had lived with for years. She had been so focused on her career, on building a life for herself and Emma, that she hadn't seen the signs. She hadn't been there when Emma needed her most. But there was no time for regret now. She had to figure out what had happened, and the journal was her first real clue. The note indicated that Emma had been aware of something dangerous, something that had likely led to her disappearance. But what could it have been? And how was John Mitchell connected to all of this? Elizabeth knew that she couldn't do this alone. As much as she wanted to keep the investigation private, to shield herself from the scrutiny of others, she needed help. And there was only one person she trusted enough to turn to, Matthew Harris, the district attorney who had been working on Mitchell's case. They had known each other for years, and while their relationship had always been strictly professional, Elizabeth knew that Matthew was someone she could rely on. He had a sharp mind and a strong sense of justice, traits that made him both a formidable prosecutor and a trusted confidant. Elizabeth grabbed her phone and dialed Matthew's number. The line rang twice before he picked up. "Elizabeth," he greeted her, his voice warm but tinged with curiosity. "I didn't expect to hear from you so soon. Is everything all right?" "No," Elizabeth replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you. It's about Emma." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Matthew spoke again, his tone more serious now. "I'll be over in 20 minutes. Elizabeth hung up the phone and sat back in her chair, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but one thing was clear. John Mitchell's cryptic warning had opened a door that she couldn't close. And now, she was about to walk through it, whether she was ready or not. 20 minutes later, Matthew arrived at Elizabeth's house, his expression a mix of concern and determination. He stepped inside, shaking off the chill of the night air, and followed Elizabeth into the study. "What's going on?" he asked, taking a seat across from her at the desk. "You sounded pretty shaken up on the phone." Elizabeth didn't waste any time. She handed Matthew the journal, her fingers brushing against the worn leather as she passed it to him. "Read this," she said quietly. Matthew opened the journal, his brow furrowing as he scanned the pages. His eyes widened slightly as he reached the cryptic note, and he looked up at Elizabeth with a questioning expression. "Do you think this has something to do with her disappearance?" he asked, his voice measured. Elizabeth nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I don't know what it means, but I can't shake the feeling that this is connected to everything. And then there's this." She gestured to the necklace that John Mitchell had been wearing. He had Emma's necklace, the same one I gave her before she disappeared. Matthew's eyes widened in surprise. "Mitchell had the necklace? Are you sure it was the same one?" "I'm positive," Elizabeth replied, her voice firm. "I designed it myself. It's one of a kind." Matthew leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "That's too much to be a coincidence. If Mitchell has the necklace, then he knows something. Why would he come forward now? What does he gain from revealing this? Elizabeth shook her head. I don't know, but he said something about Emma being involved in something bigger, something dangerous. He implied that the government was involved. Matthew's expression darkened. If that's true, then this is much bigger than we thought. And if the government is involved, we're treading on dangerous ground. Elizabeth met his gaze, her eyes filled with determination. I don't care how dangerous it is. I need to know what happened to my daughter, and I'm going to find out no matter what. Matthew nodded, his expression serious. Then we'll find out together. The walls of the courthouse seemed to close in on Elizabeth Carter as she walked down the cold, sterile corridor toward the holding cells. Her footsteps echoed against the hard floors, each step dragging her deeper into a world she never imagined she'd be part of. John Mitchell, Emma, the government, secrets that had remained hidden for nearly a decade were now clawing their way to the surface, and Elizabeth felt caught in the middle, powerless to stop the flood. She had always thought of herself as strong, unbreakable even, but now she was teetering on the edge of control. The revelations from the past few days had shaken her to the core. John Mitchell had somehow acquired Emma's necklace, a piece of jewelry that had no reason to be anywhere near him. And yet, there it was, hanging around his neck, a silent symbol of everything she feared had happened to her daughter. As she approached the cell block, Elizabeth took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had been granted permission for a private meeting with Mitchell under the pretense of discussing legal matters related to the trial. But Elizabeth wasn't interested in the trial right now. Her only goal was to get answers. The guard on duty, a burly man with a no-nonsense demeanor, glanced up as she approached. "Judge Carter," he said with a respectful nod. "Mitchell's in the last cell on the right. I'll be just outside if you need anything." Elizabeth nodded, but she didn't say a word as she walked past him, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick with tension, the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her like an invisible force. She reached the last cell, her eyes narrowing as she saw Mitchell sitting calmly on the narrow cot, his hands resting in his lap. He looked up as she approached, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. His blue eyes were piercing, as though he could see right through her. There was something unsettling about the way he held her gaze, a quiet confidence that belied his position as a prisoner. "Judge Carter," he greeted her with a slow nod, his voice calm and measured. "I had a feeling you'd come." Elizabeth's jaw tightened as she stared at him, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She hated how composed he seemed, how utterly in control. It was as if he held all the cards, and she was just another player in his twisted game. "I didn't come here to play your games, Mitchell," she said coldly, her voice echoing slightly in the narrow space of the cell. "I want answers, and I want them now." Mitchell raised an eyebrow, his smile widening slightly. "I imagine you have a lot of questions," he said smoothly. "But the real question is, are you ready for the answers?" Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat, a cold wave of fear washing over her. She had come here prepared to demand the truth, but now that she was standing in front of him, she felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. Was she ready? Could she handle whatever dark truths he was about to reveal? "I'll ask again," Elizabeth said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "How did you get my daughter's necklace?" Mitchell leaned back against the wall of the cell, his expression contemplative. "Your daughter, Emma, was part of something bigger than you can imagine. I told you that before, but I don't think you fully understood what I meant." Elizabeth felt a surge of frustration rising in her chest. "Stop talking in riddles, Mitchell. I want specifics. What was Emma involved in? Who took her? And why?" Mitchell's eyes darkened slightly as he studied her, as though he were weighing how much to tell her. "Your daughter wasn't just a victim of a random disappearance, Judge Carter. She was targeted because of what she knew, because of what she had access to." Elizabeth's brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Emma was a college student. She didn't have access to anything. Mitchell shook his head, a hint of pity in his gaze. "You didn't know your daughter as well as you thought you did. Emma was involved in a government project, something highly classified, something that very few people even know exists. Elizabeth's mind raced as she tried to process what he was saying. "That's impossible," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Emma never mentioned anything about working with the government. "Of course she didn't," Mitchell replied. "She couldn't. The project she was involved in was so secretive, so dangerous, that even speaking about it to the wrong person could have gotten her killed." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. Could this really be true? Could Emma have been involved in something so dangerous, something so secret, that even her own mother hadn't known about it? "What was this project?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mitchell's smile faded, his expression growing serious. "It's called Project Lazarus. It was designed to be a covert intelligence operation, one that operated outside of the usual channels of government oversight. Emma was recruited because of her skills that made her invaluable to the people running the operation." Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest as the pieces began to fall into place. Project Lazarus, the cryptic note in Emma's journal, the necklace. It was all connected. "Emma was a student," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking slightly. "What skills could she have possibly had that would make her valuable to something like this?" "Emma was brilliant," Mitchell replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "She was a natural at understanding complex systems, both technological and human. She was recruited because of her ability to analyze data, to see patterns where others couldn't. But more than that, she had something the government needed, something that made her a target." Elizabeth felt her stomach churn. "What was it?" Mitchell hesitated, his eyes flicking to the door of the cell, as though checking to make sure they were truly alone. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Information. Information that could expose some of the most powerful people in this country. People who would stop at nothing to keep that information buried." Elizabeth stared at him, her mind spinning. Information. That's what this was all about. Emma had somehow stumbled upon something she wasn't supposed to know, something that had made her a threat to powerful forces within the government. And now those forces had taken her. "Where is she?" Elizabeth demanded, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Where's my daughter?" Mitchell's expression softened slightly, and for the first time, Elizabeth saw a flicker of genuine sympathy in his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can tell you this. Whoever took her didn't do it for ransom. They took her to silence her. And if they're still holding her, it's because they think she knows something they can't afford to let out." Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest. Could it be possible? Could Emma still be alive, being held somewhere by people who wanted to keep her quiet? Mitchell leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "You're in dangerous territory now, Judge Carter. If you start digging into this, you're going to attract attention from people who don't want you finding out the truth." Elizabeth met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "I don't care how dangerous it is," she said firmly. "I'm going to find my daughter, no matter what it takes." Mitchell's eyes flashed with something that Elizabeth couldn't quite identify. Respect, perhaps, or admiration. "Then you'd better be prepared for what's coming," he said quietly. "Because once you start down this path, there's no turning back." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine as Mitchell's words sank in. She knew he was right. She was walking into a world of secrets and lies, a world where nothing was as it seemed. But she didn't care. She would stop at nothing to find Emma, to bring her daughter home. As she stood to leave, Mitchell called out to her one last time, "Judge Carter." She paused, turning to look at him. "Be careful who you trust," he said softly. "Not everyone is who they appear to be." Elizabeth nodded, her expression grim. She didn't need Mitchell to tell her that. She had already learned that lesson the hard way. Elizabeth Carter sat alone in her dimly lit living room, staring at the soft glow of the fireplace as if it could somehow help her make sense of everything. The weight of John Mitchell's revelations still pressed heavily on her chest. Project Lazarus, the government, secrets so dangerous they had cost Emma her freedom, maybe even her life. The thought gnawed at her like a relentless hunger, The idea that her daughter had been taken because she knew too much had shattered the fragile narrative Elizabeth had told herself all these years. She had always hoped Emma was out there somewhere, alive and well, but perhaps lost, confused, or unable to come home. But now, the truth seemed darker, more terrifying. She hadn't slept properly in days. Every time she closed her eyes, images of Emma flashed before her. The happy child, the rebellious teenager, the young woman full of promise who had vanished without a trace. And now, pieces of her life were being unearthed, pieces that Elizabeth had never known existed. How had she missed this? How had her own daughter become entangled in a conspiracy so vast, so dangerous? Without her noticing, Elizabeth's mind buzzed with questions, but one stood out above the rest. Who else knew about Emma's involvement? Who else might have been part of this? Hiding in plain sight, perhaps even within her own family. She had to find out. The next morning, Elizabeth made her way to her childhood home, where her mother, Margaret Carter, still lived. Margaret was a strong woman, practical to a fault, with a sharp mind that had always kept the family in line. She had been there for Elizabeth after Emma's disappearance, offering support in her own quiet, stoic way. But there had always been something Elizabeth couldn't quite place. An unease, a hesitation in her mother's eyes whenever the topic of Emma came up. As she pulled into the driveway of the old Victorian house, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that today, something would change. She had been running over the timeline in her head. Emma's last months, her secretive behaviors, her strange phone calls that seemed to trail off into silence when anyone else came near. Could her mother have known something back then? Could there have been signs she missed? The door opened before Elizabeth had even reached the porch. Margaret stood there, her expression as composed as ever, though her silver hair was slightly disheveled from the wind. She wore her usual no-nonsense look, her sharp eyes scanning Elizabeth with concern. "Elizabeth, what brings you here so early?" Margaret asked, stepping aside to let her daughter in. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before crossing the threshold. The smell of freshly brewed coffee greeted her, as it always did when she visited. It was a small comfort in the midst of her unraveling world. "I needed to talk to you," Elizabeth said, her voice quieter than usual. She wasn't sure how to begin, how to explain the storm that had been raging inside her since her meeting with Mitchell. Margaret studied her daughter carefully as they walked into the kitchen. "What's on your mind?" Elizabeth sat down at the small kitchen table, running her fingers along the wood grain. She had sat at this table 1,000 times growing up, sharing meals, laughing, sometimes crying. But this time, the air felt heavier and she could sense the tension rising. "It's about Emma," Elizabeth finally said, glancing up to see her mother's reaction. For a brief second, Elizabeth thought she saw something flash across Margaret's face, a flicker of discomfort, maybe even guilt, but it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. Margaret set a cup of coffee in front of Elizabeth and sat across from her, her posture as straight and proper as ever. "What about Emma?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I've learned some things recently, things about what might have happened to her." Margaret didn't flinch. She simply waited, her hands clasped together on the table, as if bracing herself for whatever was about to come. "There's a man, John Mitchell," Elizabeth continued. "He's connected to her disappearance. He told me that Emma was involved in a government project. Something secret, something dangerous." Margaret's expression didn't change, but Elizabeth could sense the tension building beneath the surface. "I know it sounds crazy," Elizabeth said quickly, trying to fill the silence. "But it's not just Mitchell's word. There are clues, things I missed, things in Emma's journal that make it clear she was in over her head." Margaret remained quiet for a moment, her gaze distant, as if she were lost in thought. Then she spoke, her voice calm, but tinged with something Elizabeth hadn't heard before, regret. "There are things you don't know, Elizabeth," Margaret said softly. "Things I never told you. I thought I was protecting you." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. She leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean? What haven't you told me?" Margaret sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly, as if the weight of years of secrets had finally become too much to bear. Emma wasn't just a college student. She was involved in something much bigger than we ever imagined. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know the full extent until it was too late. Elizabeth felt her throat tighten. What are you talking about? How could you have known and not said anything? Margaret reached across the table, taking Elizabeth's hands in hers. I didn't know the details, but I had suspicions. Emma came to me a few months before she disappeared. She was scared, but she wouldn't tell me why. She only said that she had gotten herself involved in something dangerous, something she didn't think she could get out of. I tried to get her to tell me more, but she refused. She said it was safer if I didn't know. Elizabeth pulled her hands away, disbelief washing over her. And you didn't tell me? You let me believe all this time that it was a random disappearance, that she might just be lost or hurt somewhere. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought if I stayed out of it, she would come back. I didn't want to risk making things worse. Elizabeth shook her head, anger rising in her chest. You should have told me. I could have done something. I could have helped her. Margaret's voice broke as she spoke. I was scared, Elizabeth. I didn't know what to do. And by the time I realized how serious it was, Emma was already gone. The room fell into silence, the only sound the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. Elizabeth stared at her mother, her mind reeling. How could this have been kept from her? How could her own mother have known something was wrong and not told her? Why didn't you say anything after she disappeared? Elizabeth asked, her voice shaking. Why keep it a secret all these years? Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek, her expression filled with sorrow. Because I was ashamed. I felt like I had failed her, like I had failed you. I thought maybe if I kept it to myself, I could pretend that it wasn't real, that she would come home and everything would go back to normal. Elizabeth felt a wave of nausea roll over her. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You had no right to keep this from me, she said, her voice rising. I could have done something. We could have saved her. Margaret stood as well, her eyes pleading. Elizabeth, please. I was only trying to protect you. I didn't know what else to do. Elizabeth shook her head, her emotions boiling over. You didn't protect me. You didn't protect Emma. You let her face this alone. Margaret flinched at the harshness of Elizabeth's words, but she didn't argue. She knew deep down that Elizabeth was right. She had made a terrible mistake, one she would have to live with for the rest of her life. Elizabeth stormed toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed to get out of there, needed to breathe, needed to think. But before she could leave, Margaret's voice stopped her. There's one more thing, Margaret said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Emma disappeared, she left something for you. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I found it after she was gone. Elizabeth turned slowly, her eyes narrowing. What did she leave? Margaret walked over to a small cabinet in the corner of the room, her hands shaking as she opened the drawer. She pulled out a small, sealed envelope and handed it to Elizabeth. This was meant for you, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. I didn't open it. I couldn't, but I think it's time you read it. Elizabeth stared at the envelope, her heart racing. Her name was written on the front in Emma's familiar handwriting. With trembling hands, she tore it open and unfolded the letter inside. Elizabeth Carter stood frozen in her mother's kitchen, the weight of the unopened letter from Emma in her hands, feeling almost unbearable. The envelope felt fragile, as if the slightest wrong move could tear apart whatever answers her daughter had left behind. Her breath was shallow, her heart racing. For years, she had searched for clues, for any sign that could lead her to the truth about Emma's disappearance. And now it was here, right in her hands. Her mother, Margaret, stood a few feet away, her eyes filled with regret and sorrow. She had kept this letter a secret for so long, believing that hiding it would somehow protect Elizabeth from the painful reality that her daughter had been involved in something dangerous. something that ultimately led to her vanishing. But now, Elizabeth couldn't afford to stay in the dark any longer. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't bring herself to look at her mother. The betrayal still cut too deeply. Margaret sighed, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought it would hurt you more to know, Elizabeth. After she disappeared, I was so lost. I didn't know what to do. When I found the letter, I didn't open it because I didn't want to face what it might say. I thought maybe if I left it alone, things would somehow get better. But they didn't." Elizabeth clenched her jaw, her mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. She had always been close to her mother, but now she felt like she was standing in front of a stranger. The idea that her own mother had hidden something so important from her made her stomach turn. But she couldn't focus on that now, not when Emma's letter was waiting in her hands. Without another word, Elizabeth slowly tore open the envelope, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Her eyes scanned the familiar handwriting, the words blurring for a moment before coming into sharp focus. "Mom, if you're reading this, it means I didn't come back. I didn't mean for things to go this far, and I'm sorry for whatever pain this brings you. But you need to know the truth. It started with an internship, a simple, exciting opportunity one thought would open doors for my future. But I got involved in something I wasn't prepared for. The people I'm working for, they're not what they seem. They've asked me to do things I'm not comfortable with, but now I'm in too deep. I've seen things, uncovered things that they don't want the world to know. I don't think I'm safe anymore. I've left this letter for you in case I can't tell you everything myself. You need to understand that what I've discovered could change everything. The people behind this, what they're doing, is dangerous. And if they find out what I know, they'll stop at nothing to keep me quiet. If something happens to me, if I disappear, don't believe what they tell you. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't just me running away. I'm being watched, followed, and if they get to me, it's because I knew too much. I can't tell you everything in this letter. It's not safe. But there are people who can help. There's a file. I've hidden it where no one will find it unless they know where to look. It has everything, the names, the evidence, the truth. I've left clues, and you'll know where to find it when the time comes. But please, Mom, don't trust anyone. Not even the people you think you know. They're all part of it. I love you, and I'm sorry. Emma." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she read the final words, the paper shaking slightly between her fingers. Her chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. The room seemed to close in around her, the weight of Emma's words suffocating. Her daughter hadn't just vanished into thin air. She had been taken, silenced by people who didn't want the truth to come out. And now, Elizabeth had a new mission, finding the file Emma had mentioned. It was the key to everything, the piece of the puzzle that would expose the people behind her disappearance and, hopefully, lead Elizabeth to her daughter. Margaret, who had been watching Elizabeth closely, stepped forward, her voice soft and trembling. "What does the letter say?" Elizabeth looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resolve. Emma was involved in something dangerous. She left a file, evidence. She knew they were coming for her. Margaret gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "A file? But where?" "I don't know yet," Elizabeth said, her mind racing. "But she left clues. She said I'd know where to find it." Elizabeth's mind flashed back to the cryptic note she had found in Emma's journal, the one where Emma had hinted at being in over her head. Everything was starting to fall into place. But the pieces were still scattered, and Elizabeth had no idea where to begin looking for this file. What she did know was that Emma had hidden it for a reason, and Elizabeth was going to find it, no matter what it took. "I have to go," Elizabeth said abruptly, standing up from the table. She felt an overwhelming urgency, as if every second wasted was a second further from finding Emma, or at least discovering the truth. Margaret reached out, grabbing Elizabeth's arm gently. "Please, Elizabeth, be careful. Whoever these people are, They sound dangerous." "I will," Elizabeth replied, pulling her arm free. "But I can't just sit here anymore. I need to find out what happened to my daughter." Without another word, Elizabeth left the house, her heart pounding as she made her way to the car. As soon as she was inside, she pulled out her phone and called Matthew Harris, the district attorney who had become her closest ally in the search for answers. He had been there for her through thick and thin, and now she needed his help more than ever. "Elizabeth," Matthew answered, his voice tense. "What's going on?" "I found something," Elizabeth said, her words coming out in a rush. "A letter from Emma. She left clues about a file with everything. I need your help." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Matthew spoke again, his tone serious. "Where are you now?" "I'm leaving my mother's house," Elizabeth replied. "I don't know where to start looking, but Emma said I'd know where to find it." "Come to my office," Matthew said firmly. "We'll figure it out together." An hour later, Elizabeth sat in Matthew's office, the letter from Emma spread out on the desk between them. The room was quiet, the tension palpable as they both stared at the words on the page. Matthew rubbed his chin thoughtfully, his brow furrowed in concentration. "So, Emma left a file, and she said there are clues. Did she ever mention anything to you about where she might have hidden something like that?" Elizabeth shook her head. "No, she never talked to me about any of this. I had no idea she was involved in something so dangerous. But there must be something, a place she would have felt safe, somewhere only I would know." Matthew leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. "Think back, Elizabeth. Before she disappeared, did she spend a lot of time anywhere? Was there a place she frequented? A place that had significance to her?" Elizabeth closed her eyes, trying to recall every detail of Emma's life before she vanished. She thought about the places Emma loved. Their house, the park where she used to play as a child, her school, the coffee shop she used to visit with friends. But none of those places seemed right. None of them felt like a place Emma would hide something so important. And then it hit her, the lake. Elizabeth's eyes snapped open, her heart racing. "The lake," she whispered. "She used to go to the lake near our house all the time. It was her favorite spot. We had a cabin there. Emma loved it. It was our little getaway." Matthew's eyes lit up. The cabin, that could be it. If Emma wanted to hide something important, somewhere she felt safe, that would make sense. Elizabeth nodded, her mind made up. "I have to go there. If Emma left anything behind, it'll be at the cabin." Matthew stood up, grabbing his coat. "I'm coming with you." "No," Elizabeth said firmly, standing as well. "I need to do this alone. If anyone's watching, if they're tracking us, the fewer people involved, the better." Matthew hesitated, but he could see the determination in Elizabeth's eyes. He knew better than to argue with her when she was like this. "All right," he said reluctantly, "but be careful. And if you find anything at all, call me immediately." Elizabeth nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "I will." The cabin by the lake stood just as Elizabeth Carter remembered it, nestled quietly among the tall pines, its weathered wooden walls blending into the serene surroundings. The lake itself shimmered under the late afternoon sun, reflecting a calm that Elizabeth did not feel. The last time she had been here was with Emma, years before everything had gone wrong. This place, once filled with laughter and joy, now felt like a tomb, holding secrets she had only begun to unearth. She parked the car just outside the cabin, cutting the engine and letting the silence wash over her. For a moment, she simply sat there, gripping the steering wheel as she gathered her thoughts. Somewhere within this cabin or near it, Emma had left something for her, a file that held the answers to everything. It was here, waiting to be found, and Elizabeth's entire body buzzed with the tension of knowing she was close. Too close. She stepped out of the car and walked toward the cabin door, the cool breeze carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Her footsteps were soft, almost hesitant, as if she feared disturbing the ghosts of the past that lingered here. She reached for the door, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the handle and pushed it open. The cabin interior was dim, the sunlight filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Everything was just as they had left it. The old furniture, the books scattered across the coffee table, the family photographs on the walls. It was as if time had stood still, frozen in the moments before Emma had vanished. Elizabeth's heart ached as she looked at the framed photo of the two of them, taken on Emma's 16th birthday. They had been so happy back then, so carefree. How had it all gone so wrong? Pushing the memories aside, Elizabeth focused on the task at hand. The file. Emma had left clues, and Elizabeth was determined to find them. She moved through the cabin slowly, checking each room carefully, searching for anything out of place, anything that might point her toward the file. But as the minutes ticked by, frustration gnawed at her. There was nothing, no hidden compartment, no secret message. Just the empty shell of a cabin that now felt suffocating in its silence. And then she remembered the letter. "I've left clues, and you'll know where to find it when the time comes." The words echoed in her mind, stirring something deep within her. Emma had been deliberate, careful. She wouldn't have hidden the file in plain sight. It would be somewhere meaningful, somewhere Elizabeth would instinctively know to look. Elizabeth closed her eyes, trying to think like her daughter. Where would Emma hide something so important? The answer came to her in a flash. The tree. When Emma was a little girl, she had always loved the old oak tree that stood near the lake, just a short walk from the cabin. They used to sit under its branches for hours, reading, talking, and dreaming. It had been their special spot, a place where they shared secrets and made promises. If Emma had hidden something, that was where it would be. Elizabeth rushed out of the cabin, her heart pounding, as she made her way down the narrow path toward the lake. The oak tree came into view, its massive branches stretching out over the water like protective arms. The bark was rough under her fingertips as she ran her hand along the trunk, searching for any sign of a hidden compartment, a loose piece of wood, anything. Her fingers brushed against something unusual, an indentation, small but noticeable, near the base of the tree. Elizabeth knelt down, her hands shaking as she pried at the bark. It came away easily, revealing a small, weathered metal box tucked inside the hollow of the tree. Her breath caught in her throat as she pulled the box free, holding it in her hands as if it were the most precious thing in the world. This was it, the file Emma had hidden. Elizabeth sat back on her heels, staring at the box for what felt like an eternity. Her hands trembled as she opened the lid, revealing a stack of documents inside. She pulled them out carefully, her eyes scanning the pages. What she saw made her blood run cold. Names, dates, transactions, photographs. It was all here, evidence of the conspiracy Emma had uncovered. Project Lazarus, high-ranking government officials, secret operations, the very people Elizabeth had trusted, the people she had worked with, were involved in something far more sinister than she had ever imagined. And Emma had paid the price for discovering it. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest as she flipped through the pages, her mind racing. This was bigger than she had ever anticipated. The corruption went all the way to the top, reaching into the highest levels of government. If this information got out, it would bring down powerful people. People who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. A noise behind her snapped Elizabeth out of her thoughts. She froze, her body tensing as she listened. Footsteps. Someone was coming. Quickly, Elizabeth shoved the documents back into the box and closed the lid, hiding it behind the tree as she stood up, her eyes scanning the area. Her heart raced, adrenaline flooding her system. She wasn't alone anymore. From the shadows of the trees, a figure emerged. Matthew Harris, the district attorney, stepped forward, his expression grim. For a moment, Elizabeth felt a wave of relief. Her ally had come to help her, but that relief quickly turned to suspicion as she noticed something in his eyes, something cold and calculating. "Matthew?" Elizabeth said cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing here? Matthew's lips curved into a tight smile, but there was no warmth in it. I could ask you the same thing, Elizabeth. What did you find? Her blood ran cold. Something wasn't right. You followed me, she said, realization dawning on her. Why? Matthew took a step closer, his eyes darkening. I told you to be careful, Elizabeth. I warned you not to trust anyone. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest as the pieces began to fall into place. Matthew had always been there, always offering his help, always one step ahead of her. But now she understood why. He wasn't just an ally. He was part of the conspiracy. You're one of them, Elizabeth whispered, her voice trembling. You've been involved in this the whole time. Matthew's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold indifference. You don't know what you're dealing with, Elizabeth. This isn't just some simple government cover-up. If this information gets out, it will destroy everything we've built. Elizabeth took a step back, her mind racing. She needed to get out of here, needed to get the file to someone who could expose the truth. But Matthew was blocking her path, and she knew he wouldn't let her leave without a fight. You can't stop me, Elizabeth said, her voice stronger now. I'm going to expose all of you. Matthew's eyes narrowed, and he took another step closer. I'm afraid I can't let you do that. Before Elizabeth could react, Matthew lunged toward her, grabbing her arm with a vice-like grip. She struggled, trying to break free, but he was stronger than she had anticipated. Panic surged through her as she realized how dangerous he truly was. But Elizabeth wasn't about to give up. With all the strength she could muster, she twisted out of his grasp, shoving him backward. Matthew stumbled, losing his balance for a moment, and Elizabeth seized the opportunity. She ran, her heart pounding, her legs burning, as she sprinted toward her car. Behind her, she could hear Matthew shouting, but she didn't look back. She had the file, she had the evidence, and now she needed to get it to someone who could help her finish what Emma had started. As Elizabeth reached her car, she yanked open the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. Finally, the engine roared to life and she sped down the dirt road, her mind racing as fast as the car. She had everything she needed to bring down Project Lazarus. But she also knew that the people behind it wouldn't stop until they silenced her, just as they had silenced Emma. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care